to start watching BBC Defund or Defend. The Spectator's Charles Moore and The Telegraph's Alison Pearson go up against Spectator editor and former BBC journalist Michael Gove and former BBC America editor John Sopel to debate whether it's time to defund or defend this once great institution. The first 15 minutes of this event are free to watch on our YouTube channel, but this live stream is exclusively for Spectator magazine subscribers. So you'll need to head to spectator.com/live to subscribe and view the rest. For just £3 for 3 months, you can access all of our live streams, daily commentary, podcasts, and video content. We hope you enjoy the stream.
Welcome to the latest in the Spectator's debate series. Tonight, we debate the future of a key British institution, the BBC. Please welcome to the stage our host for this evening, the Spectator's assistant editor, Isabel Hardman.
Thank you so much for coming and welcome to the Emmanuel Centre for tonight's debate, one of a series in which we test arguments from brilliant speakers on big issues. So tonight, in a very timely event, given the imminent confirmation of a new Director General, our scrutiny falls on the BBC, a unique, publicly funded institution which has been a British household favourite for nearly a century. For decades, the Beeb was the envy of the world, a highly trusted source of entertainment, drama, sport, and most importantly, news. But increasingly, with scandals over bias, wastefulness, and abuse, the BBC seems to be making as many headlines as it reports. In the age of subscription services, is our love for Auntie, and particularly its compulsory licence fee, stretched beyond repair? Many say it's time to defund the BBC, while others passionately defend the corporation and its funding model. And tonight, we'll hear both arguments. Shortly, I'll introduce our spirited debaters to the stage, but first let me explain how this evening will run. Before any of the arguments are made, you will have the chance to register your vote on the motion. Once we've taken the temperature of the room, our debaters will speak for up to 7 minutes each, before moving on to interrogate each other across the floor and then taking questions from you, the audience. We'll hear from our speakers again to close, and finally, it will be up to you to judge the arguments by registering the closing vote of the night. Do feel free to express your enthusiasm throughout by clapping, cheering, even polite booing when appropriate. We want you to feel involved, and if it gets too rowdy, I will step in. So here we are, we're ready to get underway now with the main event. Here to propose the motion, this House believes it is time to defund the BBC. Please welcome to the stage the chairman of The Spectator, biographer of Margaret Thatcher and fierce campaigner against the licence fee, Lord Moore. And the author, podcaster, free speech campaigner, and columnist at the Daily Telegraph, Alison Pearson. Welcome both of you. And then in opposition, to convince us that they are both wrong and that we should defend rather than defund the BBC, please put your hands together for a man who's graced your TV screens over decades as the BBC's man, first in Westminster, then in Washington, with 35 years as a BBC journalist, now with the Newsagents podcast. Please welcome John Sopel.
Great.
And joining John to make the case for the defence, one-time graduate of the BBC's News and Current Affairs Department, former Cabinet Minister and the editor of The Spectator, my boss, Michael Gove. Now, while our guests get themselves settled, let's take the opening vote. So on each of your seats as you came in, you'll have found this flyer with a QR code, and that same code is now appearing on the screen behind me. Please scan this in, and we can take the opening vote on the motion. So a vote for the motion is a vote to defund. A vote against the motion is a vote to defend. And we'll get to see in real time how the vote is moving. So I'll let it continue for several seconds so that we're sure to get the majority of you registering your opinion, and then I'll call the vote for now.
Oh, that's interesting.
Nearly there.
That's very close.
I can see who's voted and who's still struggling from the furrowed brows in the audience. I think we're nearly there.
Gosh, it's almost
Okay.
50-50.
So we'll call it now. Sorry if you haven't worked out what the QR code is yet. So we are now on defend is very slightly ahead, but it's close, surprisingly close. As when we take the closing vote at the end of the evening, the winning team will be the one that has moved the vote the most. Now, to the important business of the evening. First up to speak for the motion is Charles Moore. He's going to speak for up to 7 minutes. After 6, I will ring this bell and give him 60 seconds notice. At 7 minutes, I will ring the bell twice and he will have to conclude. So, Charles.
Thank you very much, Isabel, ladies and gentlemen. Just to give my sort of credentials, I'd like you to know that I was brought up almost solely with the BBC in terms of media. My parents actually didn't even have ITV when I was a child, and we did treat the BBC with utter reverence. And when we went to watch it, we went to a special room, and my father would go in, and in those days it had to warm up the television. And so he would warm it up. And then he would shout as if we were in the theatre, and we were like, "It's starting!" And you had to be there before any of the program actually began. You only ever watched a program, you had to watch it whole, and you always stopped, and you've never allowed to watch a bit of it. And we thought it was a very wonderful thing, and actually perhaps it was. But as I grew up and went out into the world and into the world of journalism, I did begin to think it was quite strange that we were making everybody pay one organization to have access to a whole medium of expression by law. It seemed the most extraordinary thing. And I can understand the historical reasons for it, but it nevertheless odd. And when I was doing research for Speaking Future, I found this article written in July 1982, so a very long time ago, but already it says, "The pressure of technological change will soon force the government to ask whether the BBC in its present form should survive. The answer will surely depend on whether the BBC can justify its claim to be the guardian and provider of a uniquely valuable public service, which new arrangements would destroy." And the author of those sentiments was me. And the fact that I was saying that at the time shows that I underrated the BBC's powers of survival very gravely, but I was already on to what the problem actually is and remains. And I would say actually that one reason why the BBC does survive, 43 years after I wrote that, is that it's been very good at intimidating politicians who want to reform it. But now the problems of technology really are taking over, and Tim Davie himself spoke about this because in a recent speech at the Royal Television Society, because in the last few years, for the first time, the license fee earnings have actually declined, and indeed, since 2017, they've fallen by 24%. So the BBC will have to find new ways of funding. I don't want to go into what they might be tonight, but that is a simple fact. So if we were trying to continue to make the BBC, to support the BBC and justify that, how would we justify it? And the answer seems to be very simply that it would have to be that we trust the BBC in a special way. And what could justify that trust? And the answer seems to me, above all, to be very obviously, and yet it's so neglected, impartiality. And again, impartiality has been broken and is being broken, and it's being broken, which I think is the most important aspect of it perhaps, being broken in the same sort of way all the time. It was broken about Brexit, it was broken about trans issues, it's broken about assisted suicide, immigration, Trump, Nigel Farage. I don't know if you remember the wonderful thing with Nigel Farage being debanked. And it was announced by the BBC, Simon Jack, that it was because his account was such a mess and not because of his politics. And this was because Simon Jack had been told it by the chairman of NatWest. It was an absolute classic way of how that sort of story worked. And Nigel was able to prove that this was completely untrue. And then, of course, Israel and Gaza, perhaps most prominently of all. And all this came together, or most of it came together, with the Prescott memo, the internal memo that the BBC had itself commissioned, but work that he commissioned. But then he wrote an angry internal memo because he could never get the BBC to admit the problems. And that really brought it all together, and it's that actually that forced Mr. Davey to resign. And then also with all that impartiality is not just the themes, but the people. So I think if we just know what Jeremy Bowen and Elise Doucette and John Simpson think about Gaza and Israel, and we shouldn't know. We just should not know. They're supposed to be telling us what's going on, but they know, and in the case of Jeremy Bowen, for example, in particular, it's always the fault of Netanyahu, everything. In the case of Elise Doucette, it's always the fault of Trump, and so on. And it's not just on this particular issue. I think if you look on climate change, you know exactly what you're being told to think by Justin Rolat, its editor. And I know the man I'm going to speak about now is not a reporter, but if you want to know, and if you're interested in the countryside and your source is Chris Packham, you're in some trouble. Now, the point about impartiality is that these are not mistakes. And it's not only that the BBC lacks balance, it's much more profound than that. It's systemic. It runs right through the whole way that they cover things. And what I think is so objectionable about it is that it hampers our knowledge. It actually means that we, the British viewers, don't understand what's going on. We can't really understand what's going on. I mean, if you look at the Brexit thing, what was so reprehensible was that the result came as such a surprise. And the reason it came as such a surprise was the BBC had never ever explained what all these grievances were. Why had we been thinking all this in this way all this time? And you can see how this works in relation to complaints, because it's absolutely fascinating to look at how BBC complaints work. Between 2017 and 25, so this current charter period, the BBC received 2,275,000 complaints, of which 200 were upheld. And only 21% of those upheld were about impartiality. Those 70% of the complaints were about impartiality. And the final court of all of this is Ofcom. And do you know how many impartiality complaints Ofcom has upheld in this period? One. Which was about the fact that when Ruth Davidson criticized Nicola Sturgeon, there was nobody else on the side of Nicola Sturgeon. That was the whole of it. Mr. Davey, as he's about to depart, said that he put it, impartiality has been a priority. And he said it's the toughest thing to manage during my tenure.
Time's up.
Yes, I will draw to a close. But I think he says that truth is the agenda to be pursued, but it's not being. And as long as it's not being, we must defund the BBC.
I'm just going to keep ringing. Thank you, Charles. Thank you very much. And now it's time to hear from John for the case for defend. Oh, Charles is back.
Good evening, and thank you, Isabel, and thank you, Charles, for proposing the motion. You think you've got problems with the BBC. I worked there for 35 plus years.
As Tony Blair might say, I've got the scars on my back. And if you think I'm going to stand here and offer a paean of praise to the corporation, you'd be mistaken. Can it be annoying? Infuriating. Is it accountable enough? Nowhere near. Is the decision-making labyrinthine? You bet. And as for W1A, I can't watch it. It's not comedy, it's documentary. Savile, the Diana interview, the Gaza documentary, Glastonbury, the BAFTAs, the panorama edit of Trump's January the 6th speech, all awful. All mistakes that, yes, have chipped away at trust. And I don't mean this as a compendious list. I'm sure you've all got your own, and Charles has mentioned some of them. For me personally, I have been having a ball since leaving the corporation 4 years ago, taking my chances in the commercial sector where suddenly we have to worry about ad revenues, sponsorship, and real-world stuff like that. But defund the BBC? Let it just wither and die? I genuinely believe that would be an act of cultural vandalism, like the Taliban blowing up the Buddhas of Bamiyan in 2001, or ISIS going after the ancient ruins of Palmyra in Syria. I share with you many of the feelings of exasperation about certain things the BBC have done and continue to do. There is arrogance, which you have alluded to, and at times a lack of accountability when mistakes happen. But as someone who spent much of his career working abroad for the corporation, I can't begin to describe what soft power it brings to Britain. Soon after the Taliban had done its worst, and post 9/11, in late 2001, I found myself moving with Northern Alliance troops on a front line in Afghanistan. We were in a town called Talakan. There was no electricity, no running water. It was sort of medieval in a way, but they had radios, and kids and adults would run up to us and speak to us in English because of what they had heard on the World Service, a station that spoke to them of liberty, of choice, and of freedom of expression. At the time I went there, I was the BBC's Paris correspondent, and in the bureau in my office, behind a perspex sheet, was a mural painted by the playwright and artist Jean Cocteau. He had given that as a present to the BBC for all its work during the Second World War, when de Gaulle was broadcasting from London to the Free French. And if you say, well, you're just harking back to a glory day that has gone, then what about all the people today who want to listen to what Steve Rosenberg has to say from Moscow, one of the few correspondents who has stayed there since the invasion? And I'm sorry, Charles, I disagree. I think Lise Doucette does a sterling job in bringing coverage of the Middle East. What about the Iranians in the diaspora who want to hear what the Persian service is reporting to try to make sense of what is happening as we speak right now in Iran? When I was the North America editor, I secured an interview with Barack Obama. And believe me, US presidents don't do many sit-downs with foreign press. Why did I get the interview? Because through the BBC Somali service and Swahili service, he would reach everyone in Africa. And it may surprise you to know that for all that Donald Trump is promising legal hellfire and brimstone against the BBC now, we're the only foreign broadcaster with a permanent seat in the White House briefing room, and the briefing room is tiny. 7 rows of 7 seats, 49 seats in total. You think of all the US outlets across the whole of the US who want to be in the White House, the BBC has a seat. The BBC travels on Air Force One with the president, one of the 12 people to go. I did, and it's not a bad way to travel, I should say. We are in the pool sprays in the Oval Office when a visiting president or prime minister is passing through. No, we're not as important as US broadcasters. But of the foreign broadcasters, we stand way, way above the rest. And wherever I've traveled around the world, just saying you're from the BBC opens so many doors, no further explanation needed. And it's not just because of news coverage. It's because of Top Gear and Doctor Who. It's because of David Attenborough. It's because of The Office. It's because of the proms, and on it goes. And here at home, the BBC still provides those office water cooler moments, those vanishingly rare occasions when the whole family sits down in front of the television and thinks, how did Nick Mohammed get it so wrong about Joe Marler in The Traitors? I started my career in local radio, where I found that, the relationship with the local community was vital. In an age when local newspapers are dying, who is there left to hold to account the local planning committee? It's the BBC journalists who are poring over tedious minutes of council meetings. And the creative industries is one of the great burgeoning, and I would say unsung industries. I had the thrill last Friday of acting a teeny-weeny little part in the next season of Slow Horses. I was overawed. There were hundreds of people involved in the production, on that one production. Where did the lighting people, the sound people, the camera crews, the makeup ladies, the props, where did they learn? What was their apprenticeship? It was at the BBC. So, by all means, say that the BBC needs to change. By all means, say that the BBC needs to improve and needs to up its game in a new way, and a new Director General is starting. When I used to be asked at cocktail parties, what did I do? I'd say I work for the BBC. They'd say, which bit? I would say the B rather than the C. You don't need to love the corporation, but the broadcasting is still offering something to Britain and the rest of the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John, and for keeping to time as well, like a true broadcaster.
Do I get extra points for keeping to time?
Yeah, if you don't have the bell ringing twice, then you do. And now we're going to hear, second for the motion is Alison.
I brought my Blue Peter annual. I'm not sure whether that's for good or for ill. A quarter of a century ago, I was standing in a clearing in a Venezuelan rainforest. From high above my head floated one of the great broadcasting voices. And here, above the canopy of the rainforest, said that voice, we are filming the life of birds. But there are no sodding birds. Spending a few days on location with Sir David Attenborough Natural History Unit was one of the privileges of my life. That small BBC team embodied what we mean by public service broadcasting. Like the great Victorian explorers, they spent months in hostile conditions so they could bring back magical images to educate and delight the viewers at home. David Attenborough will celebrate his 100th birthday in May, and as long as Attenborough is still with us, we may feel that the BBC cannot die. But I will argue that that BBC, the trusted BBC of our childhood, of Richard Baker and Kenneth Kendall and Sue McGregor and Dad's Army and Val, John and Pete and Blue Peter badges, the BBC to which so many of us feel a sentimental attachment is already gone. Today's BBC no longer deserves the title national broadcaster because to a great extent the staff of the BBC, journalists, managers, creatives, they don't really like our nation very much. They all share the same progressive politics, the same fashionable metropolitan concerns. The BBC is pro-Remain, pro-immigration, pro-net zero, pro-trans, pro-Palestine, pro-pronouns. And it regards people who are against those things not just as misguided, but morally defective. Actually, you know what? All credit to the BBC. Thank you. Let us give credit where credit's due. It's no small thing to bring together a coalition of enemies that includes left-wing feminists and Donald Trump. Today's BBC speaks for Stoke Newington, but not for Stoke-on-Trent or Stoke Poges. Yet the BBC is perfectly happy to take £180 a year from 23.8 million licence fee payers, but not to really fairly represent those people's views or even the sports that they love. How many older viewers would like to watch the Ashes and can't afford a subscription to TNT Sports? They want the BBC to show the cricket, but no, No cricket is televised by the BBC, it's only on the radio. I suppose if England could find a trans person to open the batting, the BBC might suddenly find the funding. For the first time in nearly a century, the BBC has dropped the Oxford and Cambridge boat race to, and I quote, prioritise budget-friendly content and deliver better value. Really? Budget-friendly? Every summer, the BBC spends millions broadcasting the Glastonbury Festival. Last year, 550 BBC staff descended on a field in Somerset to schmooze and provide live streams from 5 main stages. Now, if you didn't feel you were getting quite enough anti-Semitism from the Today programme, you could see Bob Villan leading the Glasgow crowd in delicious chants of death to the IDF. The BBC later agreed that Mr. Villan's words broke editorial guidelines, but none of the staff who had the authority to cut that live feed bothered to do so. Why not? You know, the BBC is very censorious when white working class people stir up racial hatred, but they're not averse to stirring up hatred of Israel or Jews. Now, in May last year, something really upset me. The Today programme interviewed a UN official, Tom Fletcher, who said that 14,000 babies will die in Gaza in the next 48 hours if Israel's blockade isn't lifted. The interview didn't query that figure, 14,000. Where are all these babies? No, that would have involved journalism, and this was propaganda, right? The horrifying BBC story about 14,000 babies went around the world, but it wasn't true. The UN admitted it was misrepresentation, and Tom Fletcher said in future he would need to be more precise with my words. It was a lie, ladies and gentlemen, a blood libel against the Jews that was given huge airtime by the BBC, which has a verify unit to spot misinformation, but only the misinformation it doesn't agree with. So I think a major reason the BBC should be defunded is because it is institutionally anti-Semitic. I believe the BBC is partly to blame The BBC must take some responsibility for the poisonous climate in which Jewish ambulances were firebombed this week. Jews often cite the BBC as a reason they are leaving the UK. And boy, do they hate the BBC's international editor, Jeremy of Arabia. That kind of leftist propaganda, Orwellian censorship of wrongthink is endemic in every aspect of the BBC output, from drama to news and current affairs. And as Charles has said, as a national institution, the BBC wields enormous power when it comes to shaping public opinion. Now, Lord Moore and I have, over the years, ventured onto Question Time. Don't tell them we love Margaret Thatcher, Charles. So the producer says, it's in Basingstoke, and you think, they're going to be some friendly Spectator or Telegraph readers in the audience in Basingstoke. But no, coachloads of Corbynists. There is no political balance in those audiences. So yes, the BBC is very keen on diversity. Every TV detective has an Asian or a black partner. The BBC rams diversity down our throats, but never diversity of social class, never diversity of thought. Remember when the newsreader Martine Croxall had to read out a story about pregnant people, and she rolled her eyes and she said, women, obviously. The BBC upheld a complaint against Martine Croxall, even though she was clearly representing the views of the majority of people. And let's just think in the next few years. In 2029, we're likely to have a centre-right government. Which member of the BBC staff, apart from the security guards and the people in the canteen, will vote reform? We won't have a single member of the BBC editorial team voting for reform. It's preposterous.
Right,
the BBC must be defunded. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. Thank you. And now, finally, to speak against the motion for the second time is Michael.
Alison Pearson is a Conservative. Charles Moore is a Conservative. I'm a Conservative, and yet I'm on a different side to them. But I'm backing the BBC, not despite being a Conservative, but because I'm a conservative. The great conservative thinker of the last 100 years, Roger Scruton, put it well when he said that the work of destruction is quick, easy, and exhilarating. The work of creation, slow, laborious, and dull. Hence, we must always strive to amend things and never to tear them down. Because let's be clear what this debate is about. It's not an expression of dissatisfaction with bias. It's not a call on the BBC to amend or to reform itself. It's a call from the other side to destroy the BBC, to tear it down, to remove the funding that makes it distinctive, special, and precious, and to leave it to the winds of the marketplace where its distinctive contribution will wither and die. And as a conservative, I believe in defending our institutions, not in tearing them down. And of course, there are UK institutions that you can find flawed. Out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever made. Charles makes a fair point that the license fee is a curious way to fund an institution. But while the license fee may well be anomalous, so is our established church. So is a second chamber with hereditary members. So is our hereditary monarch. But each of them are organic expressions of our national character built up over generations, which if we were suddenly to seek to fell them, to take an axe to their roots, would deprive us of yet another institution that brings us together at a time when so many are seeking to tear us apart. And that's why I'm delighted to be on the same side as John, a distinguished broadcaster who's given his life to journalism, who is many, many things, but not a conservative. But the one thing that we do recognize is that those parts of British life which are plural, I hate the word inclusive, but sometimes there's no better term for it. Those parts of our life that bring us together are worth defending. And yes, the BBC may be biased, but Alison is wrong in thinking that it's suddenly lurched to the left. The BBC has always had a certain softish, leftish, liberal, metropolitanish flavor in a lot of areas. Hugh Green was the Director General in the 1960s. Alison would have you believe that was the golden age of the BBC. But Hugh Carlton Green, when he was Director General, had a caricature of Mary Whitehouse in his office as a five-breasted gorgon. He denounced her and the very idea of social conservatism as a force against which he was determined to fight. And yet it was that same BBC that was incubating and broadcasting Civilization, Jacob Bronowski's The Ascent of Man, producing the glories that we now look back on as the apogee of the BBC at its best. Because the BBC contains multitudes. The BBC, yes, does have those liberals, those metropolitans, but what it also has alongside it is the capacity to reflect the whole of Britain back to itself and to reflect the best of Britain back to itself. The BBC funds 5 symphony or philharmonic orchestras. The BBC is responsible for 68 days of high-quality classical music through the proms, through Young Musician of the Year, through the BBC's Young Artist Competition. It is one of the biggest, actually the biggest, the most generous philanthropist supporting high art and culture in the United Kingdom. Defund it if you will, but what are the consequences for our culture, for those of us who believe that it is right to raise the sights of the next generation to something special, cherishable, and distinct? If you say, sorry, I don't like Jeremy Bowen's tone of voice, or I'm afraid that Lise Doucette's views seem to me to be, in this broadcast, not mine. And I should say, whatever you think of Jeremy Bowen or Lise Doucette, and they're both brave reporters, I don't think there's a single person in this room who could say that they knew what the political views of Chris Mason, the BBC's political editor, were. Yes, there are certain journalists who've got views. Sometimes those views might be apparent to us, but when you're employing, as the BBC does, thousands of journalists, then the fact that the other side could only mention a handful whose views are apparent reflects the fact that the overwhelming majority of those who work in the BBC strive every day to put the news first and their views back. Simon Jack, whom Charles mentioned, broke a story about Nigel Farage He didn't seek to damn Nigel Farage. That story was the making of Nigel Farage before he became an MP. Simon was the witting or unwitting progenitor of Nigel Farage, being seen as, how precious this is in politics, a victim. So the idea that you can tar the entire corporation in that way is wrong. And the other thing about the corporation as well is that it knows that it makes mistakes. The Prescott Review that was cited by Charles, who commissioned it? Not the government, not the Conservative Party, the BBC itself. Who was the person responsible for commissioning it? Robbie Gibb, a BBC governor, attacked. For what reason? For being too Tory. It is the case, of course, that in some areas, indeed, as Alison has mentioned, the BBC has platform figures with whom I profoundly disagree. But that's because it's interviewing them. And there are other occasions in which the BBC reflects a point of view that some might consider to be establishment. Is there anyone who thinks that the BBC's coverage of the coronation or of the Queen's death was an example of revolutionary Trotskyist ferment on our screens? Of course not. So what I would ask of you is to acknowledge that the BBC, in holding up a mirror to Britain, reflects, of course, some of the distempers and some of the difficulties of our time. But what it also reflects is some of the best of us. And when you think of the BBC, always bear in mind the words of Walter Matthau and Jack Lemmon to Marilyn Monroe at the end of Some Like It Hot. Nobody's perfect.
I hope you're enjoying BBC Defund or Defend. If you want to continue watching this debate, you'll have to be a Spectator subscriber. If you're still not signed up, fear not, you can subscribe in seconds and get 3 months for £3. Head to spectator.com/live and don't miss another moment. That's it for the live stream here on YouTube. We're still in full flow over at spectator.com/live, where you can continue watching as a Spectator magazine subscriber. For just £3 for 3 months, your Spectator subscription includes full access to our website and app, along with a whole host of other benefits like subscriber newsletters and, of course, our live stream broadcasts. So head over to spectator.com/live to watch the rest.